Welcome to PJFM in Conversation. My name is Elizabeth Nonemaker, and I'm the freelance classical music critic for the Baltimore Sun. It's my pleasure to welcome Bernadette Wegenstein, the director of The Conductor. Bernadette, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'd like to start off by learning a little bit about how you came to be interested in making a documentary about Marin Alsop. What was your initial inspiration?
So I moved to Baltimore and to work here at Johns Hopkins as a professor of media studies and also a filmmaker. And when I moved here, people told me, because I'm originally from Vienna, oh, you should probably go and see the BSO. It's a really great symphony. And they assumed that I would be interested in classical music because I'm Viennese, which it's the case, as well. But I went to see, I think it was Brahms, and that's how I saw Marin Alsop the first time on the podium. And I was really taken by the performance of the BSO under her conducting, but also I was really taken by this question that I immediately had. I'd never seen a, major conductor be a woman. And, even though I have written and I've, done other films about feminism, feminist histories of marginalized people, that particular history, was sort of unknown to me. And I contacted Marin, or better, I think there was an event where we were both invited because through Hopkins, since she's also at the Peabody, and the Peabody is a part of Hopkins. So I met her really through Hopkins. And I approached her and she told me about Sylvia Kadoof, who was a conductor in the 60s and also an assistant to Leonard Bernstein. And she told me the story that Sylvia, in order to be able to allow really even to conduct on the podium, they had to change the bylaws. And so I was very touched by that. I thought, what, the 60s, And then I started researching this forgotten history of women conductors, and Marin was sort of the central figure of it. But originally the project was called We Conduct. And it was about other women and, other, outsiders to the profession, people of color as well. And I ended up, however, deciding probably a year into making this film that it should be about one person, so that it is a better story that we can really travel with, because it is a documentary, and storytelling is sort of a device that you need to create so that you really emotionally can be going on a journey. And so for that reason, I really wanted it to become a story about the person I had the best access to, which was Marin.
Yeah, I'm always interested in timelines for big projects, and documentaries can take years and years and years to make. How long did it actually take you to work on this film? Do you count that first experience going to the BSO as kind of the seed that was planted for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you count that, it's about 5 years. Okay. And, it's about 5 years. You take about a year to develop something. Then we were actively in production for 2 years, and we were in post-production for quite a long time, over a year. And in fact, post-production hasn't even ended. I was just all this morning on calls with our post house here in Baltimore. We're finally printing a DCP, which is, the copy you need for a theatrical release, which we're very lucky to have starting in January.
It's exciting. So I'm interested in your background, which is extensive. It spans linguistics, semiotics, literature, and media studies. And you've, of course, made several other documentaries on topics ranging from extreme makeover shows to Holocaust survivors. So clearly you're someone who's not afraid to dive headfirst into possibly intimidating subject matter. So I'm interested to hear about what it was like to immerse yourself in the world of classical music, which can definitely feel intimidating to some people.
Yeah, thank you. That's, yes, I have a little bit of a different background. I was just teaching this morning, I try to teach my undergraduates, especially that, now they say they're pre-med because they are convinced they want to be medical doctors, but you really don't know, when you're 18, what you're going to do. And it's important to find something that you're really passionate about. In my case, it was actually, my first passion was language and storytelling. So my mother was a great storyteller, and I do want to say about the classical music background. My grandparents were on my mother's side from Austria were classically trained musicians. In fact, my grandfather was an opera singer and my grandmother a pianist. And this was, however, the Nazi era. So nobody was really able to have like this amazing career in classical music. But it definitely left my mother with this, who was not a musician trained, but she was very knowledgeable. And I learned the piano as a child. I mean, that's really not important because I don't think I was very good, but still, I had a very high opinion, and I was brought to a lot of concerts already as a child. I had a high opinion of musical art, and I was certainly coming from a family that valued that. And there might be something about a profession that my grandparents weren't able to really succeed in, that was sort of a theme in the family that made me even more interested in this art. But as a child, I grew up speaking Italian and German, and Swiss German. So I already spoke a dialect and two languages that are both Indo-European, but they're, however, from different language families. And then I studied Latin and ancient Greek in school, and I was just, really interested in linguistics and semiotics, for that matter, on a more even theoretical, historical level. How are languages connected, and what are language trees? How is thought connected to language? And that's my academic background. That's really still with me. Even if I make a film about classical music, I'm very structuralist. So the first thing I did with this film is, you're totally right, I really dove into, for instance, Mahler, who I always loved, but I never really understood his music as well as I do now after years of studying. And so I hired a tutor at Peabody, and I had access to her as a faculty member. I mean, we had to pay, but we get a discount. And so I said, well, why not study once a week with a young composer, Alexa? And so for a year, I took classes with her, and I went through all the scores of every single musical piece that's in our film. And she helped me read it, and she helped me read the structure behind it. I wanted to understand, why is the first movement, where are the themes and melodies that are coming back in other movements. And we used that very much in the dramaturgy of putting the film together as a narration.
That is so fascinating. So you were actually studying with somebody in order to give yourself a kind of musical background.
Absolutely. I mean, I studied for so long, Elizabeth. I mean, first of all, I started with listening to all of Bernstein's talks about classical music. My favorite one, obviously, is Linguistics and Classical Music, where he tells the story of all children in the world will kind of say na 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 when they are mimicking each other. It doesn't matter what language they're or culture they're from, and he explains why that is. And I mean, it's just so fascinating to think about music as syntax. And then after my kind of anecdotal, really listening to all of Bernstein's speeches about music, I did some reading, even Schopenhauer, philosophy of music. But then I thought, no, I really want to study with an actual musician. And so I studied with Alexa. And I remember, we went through all the scores, whether it's Mass or Mahler, Mozart. And I just really needed to understand, in a way, how is each of these pieces constructed? What was its intention at the time? And it helped in the editing, for sure, but it also helped me to produce it, because I don't know, I was just much more with it. So this linguistic training that I have in several languages, of which English really is one of the last ones that came into the picture, at least at this professional level. Now, I'm reading in English and speaking English to my own children, even though they also speak German. But we often fall back into English because we live here in the United States. But it was certainly never a language that growing up I would ever even think or dream of, that everything would suddenly move into this other way of thinking and speaking. And
Mhm.
I'm ready to do this at any time, you know. I mean, I don't know, maybe in 5 years I'm going to be living in Latin America and everything will be just Spanish. I'm completely open to that. And that's, I think, how I launch myself into any topic. You know, when I made a film about breast cancer, I spoke with so many doctors and so many patients. My world was just, you know, the world of breast cancer. And I respect every world that I enter to the highest degree. And I guess the reason I became a documentary maker is that only understanding academically and looking in a way down at the subject wasn't enough for me. I want to be immersed in it, and I want to almost be able to reproduce it myself, you know. So that's kind of my, I guess, pleasure principle, is really to be inside of it.
Yeah, and it's I mean, I get the sense from your other work and absolutely from the conductor too, that it's not just about looking at this kind of for lack of a better word, like an academic view of a topic, but it's also about telling a story that is guided by a person. And that was something that I noticed in this documentary, is that, you know, I wouldn't say that it's a documentary about classical music per se, so much as it is about a single classical musician. Um, but it's difficult to kind of, I guess the question is, can you talk about how did you decide which aspects of Marin's professional and musical life to highlight when you wanted to tell her personal story?
Yeah. And I think it's a great question, really. And it is complex, you know, as you just said. Are you making, you know, what is really the topic of your film? And I think for me, any film and even books, it's important for me that there are many themes that kind of converge on different levels. I think the complexity of culture really is worth making something new about, because I can, you know, as you say, I can say, you know, this is the classical music part, this is the part about feminism.
Mm-hmm.
I can do an essay, you know, that sort of sorts all this out in terms of information. But when you put it together, it becomes something new and unique. And I guess that's where maybe, especially, you know, I didn't come to filmmaking very early in my career, but maybe as an aging artist, you know, I become more of an artist than an academic, more and more so, because I believe that the real truth of something is really about its condensation. And for the condensation, you have to have so much information. And then I always think of making a film or editing it is like, you know, squeezing out its essence. And then something comes out and you don't even know to which extent it's made of this or that. It's like genetics, you know, but it is something new. And in terms of when did we decide, or you know, is it more about the classical music, or is it more about the art of conducting, which is of course another theme in this film, you know, what is conducting? Or is it more about Marin? You know, this was a very organic process that sort of came about almost naturally. But the way I went about it in the creative process was to really follow Mahler's principle of his first two symphonies, where he himself said he tried to really put every single emotion he's ever felt into these two symphonies, as if there was really nothing else to be said afterward. And so every scene we constructed, I wanted to condense as many emotions into it, such as the triumph of being the first woman, but then the setback of being told, oh, it looks weird to have a woman moving her rear back on the podium. The brilliance of being in control as a storyteller who tells her own story, you know, because I make her tell the story, which was one of the devices I believe strongly about, to empower my subject. You know, I didn't want to be talking about her, but then I needed her to open up and really also let us look into her wounds a little and into her scars. So I think for me, what's flat and not interesting about filmmaking is if there's, you know, if a scene is just about one thing. I like it to be about more things. And so the biography needs to be also reflected in the music we're listening. The music we're listening, and when we listen to Bernstein's Mass, and we're talking about the community of Baltimore, you know, then we need to also see the community and experience, for instance, orchids. So these are all things that are constructed as, as convergence. And I think that's what's different from, let's say, making a film and writing an academic piece, because when I write something academically, then I can just really objectify it and stay within the boundaries of its discipline. And film makes you cross boundaries, but you have to do it. You have to do it even from the way you edit, because you always start hearing something first before you see it. That's one of the rules of editing. There isn't like, if you look at Avid or Premiere, you'll see that the sound's always coming first. Right. And so there isn't something like where there's really sort of a one-on-one convergence of themes.
Right. You started talking about something that I wanted to ask you about, which is, how you create structure in a documentary. And one of the things that really jumps out about Marin's story is, and that, if I were making a film about it, it seems like this perfect moment, which is that, she was inspired to become a conductor at 9 years old by going to a concert given at one of Leonard Bernstein's young people's concerts. And then, she eventually winds up studying with him at Tanglewood. After she had been rejected from these other institutions, he becomes this really crucial mentor for her. And in your film, you kind of bookend it with these stories, and you end with a kind of visual suggestion that Marin could be the equivalent of Bernstein to another young person in her own work. And so I have a couple of questions about this. And the first is that, when you set out to create a documentary, whether it's the conductor specifically or in general, are you looking for these perfect narrative gems like that to structure it? Or does the structure kind of reveal itself as you go along? And you've already started talking about that a little bit, but maybe a little bit more specifically about how the story of the conductor came out.
Yeah, that's also a really great question. So I do look for the story to reveal itself to me. So it's a very poetic process. I don't like to force anything onto it. And so thinking about that little girl and the scenes, 3 scenes, and they're really reenactment scenes, Elizabeth. So we want to call them what they are. And if you had asked me a few years ago, would you ever make a reenactment scene in documentary? I would have said absolutely not, because it's kind of a device that
it's very clear, though, when you're watching it, like which is the found footage, which is the real footage, and which is the reenactment.
It is.
They all kind of blend together.
It's true, but for me, like reenactment, originally like screams like a cheap way to make a point and to kind of have people redo something that we all know is redone now. And I actually don't think that reenactment bring a lot of emotions to the table. However, I'm very proud of this one because it sort of came to me, and I don't know how, suddenly I decided, if you really knew how random sometimes or arbitrary these processes are, I was looking for children, because she was a child. So that is structural. Okay. So I knew I wanted to see some children in the audience, but I could have just kind of looked for children and filmed audience members. Right. And that again, was inspired by, the Magic Flute by Bergman. And that famous, film where the whole film starts with only audience members, right? You hear da-da, and then, you go for like 6 minutes and you see just reaction shots of people watching the screen, right? Or the stage, really. And so, of course, I knew that film very well. And I knew that I wanted to see kids in the audience structurally, because that is, as you say, resonates with her stories, seeing Bernstein. But it didn't become a reenactment until I talked to some friends in Vienna. And I asked, what kind of kids go to concerts nowadays? Like, for whom is it normal, because classical music is just like, and they said, well, the Wiener Sängerknaben, that choir, the children's choir, their private school, elementary school, which is public, by the way, not private. They of course are very involved with going to concerts. And one of my best friends in Vienna, her daughter was at that school. And so then I said to her, has she ever gone to the concert house in the group? And they said, yeah, absolutely, they go all the time. So then I mimicked culture in a way that I knew this is happening anyway for this group of kids, but then I sort of set it up and I reenacted it. But it was kids who already always go, and they are in a music school. So they weren't actors, but they were also in a natural environment. And so then what I love about documentary is, in a way, it always brings out the truth on its own. But then when we looked at these kids and they ran up the stairs and all that, it looked so natural. They knew where they were. So we were able to do that. And then I went one step further into the direction of really feature films, is that I took one of the girls, and I had a designer with me and a stylist, and we bought a wig, and we made the wig exactly look like when Marin was young. And however, we styled her so that it's really hardly noticeable. So it's like this secret reenactment. And I'm very happy how it works, because people, unlike you, some people ask me about it, but most people don't even realize it. And yet there's so much work and thought behind it. And until I made that step to actually put a wig on her and say, no, I do want her to look like the young Marin, but not that it's too much in your face. And so I wanted this to be very subtle. And so it is, it was a very difficult thing to pull off, and it worked, but it sort of revealed itself through the storyline of wanting to put the viewer in the position of the history and then the future, with the little girl at the end who says, if Marin Alsop can do it, so can I. And so I wanted to close that circle, but it takes a while to make it work. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think this time, in this film anyway, it did work.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. The flip side of editing a documentary is all the stuff that you have to cut out when you decide on that single story. And you talked a little bit earlier about some of your initial ideas for this film and about marginalized voices in general. But I'm also curious, are there parts of Marin's story that you wanted to tell and you didn't have the time to, or that you could make a follow-up documentary if you had endless time and resources?
Sure. So, we did show a few scenes, or film a few scenes with Sylvia and Marin together in Lucerne.
Yeah, she makes an appearance.
She makes this appearance at the very end, but we didn't use the scene in the film itself. I do want to say I made a short documentary of some of this material, and some that I filmed extra for the Austrian television called ORF. And in that one, we did use Sylvia Kaduf because she speaks German. This is a whole synchronized, short TV version where it's much more academic. You can really pack it with information. And so we were able to use that scene, but it wasn't very cinematic, and so I didn't want it in the feature doc. And because it's just a conversation, so it's very brainy. Another reason that I didn't use it, now that you're asking me, for instance, is that there was a scene that was quite interesting, but it felt a little resentful. There were these two women walking through the hall in Lucerne, and there were all these pictures of male conductors, and they were talking about the fact that there were no women conductors on the walls. And so these are very fine decisions that my editor and I really made, because I do want to work through the past, but I don't like resentment. It's a very, very negative emotion. It's very dangerous. Right now, I think a lot of the conspiracy theories we're experiencing right now in our culture are fueled by resentment, in my opinion. And so I think it's a very destructive emotion. Also, being Austrian, it's such an Austrian emotion. I know so many resentful Austrians. It's just, so anyway, when anything feels just slightly resentful, for me, I have to cut it out, because it just doesn't work, because resentment it doesn't get the viewer anywhere where they learn anything. They just feel resentment, and that's not, what can I do? I love sadness. I love, I love even negativity, even aggression, but resentment, I just cannot have it. So that's why that scene was a little colored by it. In the German version, where we have like a synchronized voiceover in German, then it's not so cinematic, and so the resentment didn't come through, and I think it works.
Mhm.
As to what other aspects of Marin's life did I not include, I would say I'm pretty happy to have included anything that I feel, you know, um, ready for the screen and sort of dignified to share, because she really doesn't do much more than conduct all the time and think about her next concerts. It's not like she has this hidden world where she's then, doing other things that nobody knows. But there's one thing that I definitely manipulated a little bit through the storytelling, and that is she talks a lot more about her dad, and the way that he really gave her this encouragement than you see in the film, because he only appears twice. And the reason is that there were just too many father figures, because once we had introduced Bernstein, he became that figure, even in the gesture of holding her arm around her, so it's a very fatherly figure in that sense. And I didn't want to have too many fathers. I mean, it's just a 90-minute film. And so there wasn't a room for really going a little deeper into her relationship with her dad, which is a beautiful relationship. And we did include the conflictual relationship with her mother. And I would say that one, I think we just nailed it. I think it was not too much and not too little. It's there. And with things like that, you don't want to, it's not necessary to say more, because it's already clear then that this conflict exists. If somebody says, that she forgave her for all her neglect. Now, do we need to know how she neglected her in concrete terms? I don't think so. I think we, in fact, can imagine more if we're not told exactly what happened. So in that sense, I think I'm happy. With the dad, there were some stories, that I loved, such as apparently he was also a handyman. And so whenever they moved to a new place, he said, oh, let's build this. And then he would come out with all this equipment, and he would start building out a concert hall, or like a performance hall in some sort in their new home. And Marin would stand there and say, that's crazy, I mean, like, do we need this really? And he would come out with his hammer. There's some pictures that underline those stories. So I could have told that story. And the reason we didn't is because, I don't know, I think, storytelling is very delicate. It would have given us, I think, too much information, and we would have thought too much about the father. And to me, there was no reason really to do it. But again, it's a nice story, and it gives you more of an idea of how she was brought up. And, he was from Utah, and one of many children. And I think they were farmers, and every child learned like some sort of a manual job and an instrument. And I love that, it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
But it's not.
Yeah. That's, it is apparent in, as a classical musician watching this documentary, we have a ton of mentors, and yes, there are usually one or two that kind of stand out. But it's true that, Bernstein is the one he is the most important one. So why, for the sake of a documentary, why?
Exactly. I agree. Absolutely. And the other thing is, even now, I think just recently I gave an interview with the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival, and they asked me, is Marin Jewish? And I said no. And her father's family is from Utah, and I think it's a Mormon family. And she mentions that too. I just didn't want to bring religion into the picture, and for people to start, I don't know, I just didn't like that idea of going too far out in terms of this social background that she has. I'm very much in that sense an American now. I think you are to a certain extent a self-made person, and okay, it's important to know where you're from, but what's more important to me is, what you're doing now.
Right. So we kind of dove right into the weeds of thinking about making a documentary in the editing room and planning it and just kind of, in your head. I did want to ask you, what were some of the challenges and joys of actually being on the ground and filming this? I think I read in another interview that filming some of the concerts could be a little bit tricky, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it was great to be filming live performances. And I was just on a panel in Naples about exactly that, how do you, the art of capturing art in your film, and in this case, classical music. And I think the bar is very high because we've seen a lot of very boring representations of classical music, and it can be really boring because there's 30 to, I don't know, 80 people and they're in unison or not. And sure, you can read off their faces the music, but in order to really film it well, you need to think about something else, because otherwise it's not cinematic. And so it was a challenge. We worked with 3 different cinematographers on this project, and each of them brought something very special to the table, especially, in regards to the live music. I would say the first one, John Benham, he is, he specializes not only, but also in really like a long lens photography of animals. And he often, films for National Geographic and other nature films. And so I told him, I want you to look at Marin as if she was a bird, and you're just sort of spying on her, and you're really afraid that she's going to fly away. So whenever you capture her with this really, really big lens, and I'm speaking of like a $200,000 lens that we had to bring into the BSO, and they said, you have 20 minutes to film, and we had to set it up, and then we actually realized we were in the wrong balcony, so then we had to climb over to the other balcony to get her. And that was a little bit of a commotion that I'm sure the people working with us that night weren't too happy about. But I hired, my producer really introduced me to John, Annette did. And so he was really focused on this very, long lens, and then slow motion, of course, where slow motion will show you things that you never knew that they were there, right? And not even the person performing. So it's a way of looking at life in a magically, almost sacred intimacy that the free eye would never be able to capture. The other way that I wanted to capture these performances was with, so Judith in Austria, she set up a ton of cameras at the concert house debut concert. And, and they were great because we were able to really cross cut, and have this full sense of immersion. So it's not about sort of spying and getting close to this one action, but really getting the action from all ends. And for that, you needed the children, as I told you, who were cast into the audience, and you needed, of course, Marin. She needed her backstage, and you needed her, when she comes out. So when you just see that one shot, these are 3 or 4 camera operators, so that you can tell that story as a feature, as a narrative, really. And in that scene, it was really tricky because one of our cameras started beeping because it had run out of batteries, or the card was full, and we couldn't remove it because we were, filming live, and it was very stressful. I was backstage, and fortunately, it was during Hindemith, and not during Lehrer Auerbach, which we had already finished. And then with the Hindemith, I said, well, Hindemith could be part of the score, which was kind of a bad joke. But anyway, it was very stressful to remove that beeping camera, but we did it. And then I would say, the director of photography actually was yet another cinematographer, Shauna, and I had started with her. And I think her way of really showing the music that was different from what I had seen in classical music is that we filmed it like a cinema verite, we filmed it both the rehearsals and the live performances, where she would sort of go from one to the next as if they were in a dialogue, even though she was not musically trained, but I would through the monitor be able to say, and now, the strings are talking to the brass, and this was, for instance, Rimsky-Korsakov, and now the flutes are going to respond and say, yes, but I'm still so upset, so I would sort of narrate it out to her, what sort of emotion I was feeling, that they would be saying. And so she was sort of moving her camera around as if this was a scene, a family scene where people are talking. And so I think that in these three ways of capturing the music, we really brought it to life in a way that I think is usually, usually you don't spend so much time thinking about how can I cover it, but it's about coverage. But for us, it was for much more. And the Mozart, I wanted it to be filmed in a very particular way. So anyway, every single classical performance, we had hours of meetings, how I wanted to see it. And I think that all three cinematographers really brought something important to the table. And the Post House here in Baltimore were amazing to then color and connect it all, because sometimes, it doesn't look like it's from the same cloth, but with a good colorist. And also we shot most everything with the Amira, which is a very, very good camera and has a 4K capacity. So you can really link all this together beautifully. It's expensive, I can tell you that, but yeah, that's how we did that.
I could keep asking you questions, probably, I'm realizing now, for, another hour. But I did want to ask you at least this question, which is, I'm wondering if you could reflect on what Marin's story means to you personally. And I was also thinking of this as you're describing just making a documentary film, and the fact that you started out in linguistics and what it's like to, it sounds like you had to teach yourself some of this in your career. But, more broadly, you're a female filmmaker, Marin is a female conductor, you're two women working in fields that historically have been dominated by men. So what do you take away from her story, and what do you hope others take away from it?
Yeah, so I think, I take away that if you are marginalized, as Marin was in her field, you can overcome, these marginalizations with an extreme brilliance. And you have to, as she says, because if you're not standing out in brilliance, you will not be noticed. So you have to be much better than the rest if you are an outsider. And what I take away from it is that it comes at a cost that is what it is. So I let her sort of succeed, but then bump, and I wanted people to understand that this success comes, however, with a sacrifice, which sounds very, like a Christian metaphor, and I don't want to say it that way, but it comes with certain scars and certain things that you didn't get, or that hurt you. And those will never go away for yourself, but maybe for the next generation, which is why I lean so much into what she's giving to this new generation of women conductors, and to the little girl who sees this story and this figure, and says, yeah, sure, why shouldn't I be a conductor? For her, it's not a big deal. That to me is instead of going into the resentment department of looking back and saying all the things that you didn't get, you're looking forward to the next generations, and to see how you can shape culture and the world, really, to making it an easier place for those who are coming in after you. That is what I took away, and that's how I structured the film. That's why I'm leaving us with this feeling of hope. Mm-hmm. How do I identify with this? I grew up as an outsider in my own family. And, this is not the time to talk about that, but I certainly have been an outsider in many ways myself. And I decided to come here to the United States after a postdoc. I had the choice to either go back to Austria or to try and kind of make a life for myself here in the US. And I did that because I love looking forward and into kind of new directions and new possibilities. And where I came from and how I grew up was a very conservative way that would certainly not, I think, have allowed me to kind of do the kind of work that I do here. Certainly not in such a great academic environment that gives me absolute freedom, to develop in any direction I want. But I worked very, very hard, for it, and I still do. So it certainly is not something that comes that easily. I became a filmmaker as a second career, so to speak. And in that sense, I had already the confidence of having, one career and being able to make a living. So as a woman filmmaker, I think I do see the limitations. And for instance, now I'm thinking of bigger projects that I want to do in the future that I wouldn't have had the confidence to even thinking about before. So in that sense, I think I'm a classic female filmmaker who doesn't perhaps believe in herself, as much until I get, I make a film that people just really love to see. So I do think that it has a lot to do also with the confidence that you give yourself and that the culture has given you until, and you have to just do it anyway. I mean, I don't make a film for a festival or for a distribution. I just make it the way that I feel it's right. So in other words, I can very much identify with this position of being an outsider. And as to Marin's story, I think what's so beautiful is that she's able to give back what she didn't get. And that's, to me, what the film is about.
I did want to add, so this is the last question. How can audiences see your film if they don't get a chance to see it at this festival?
So the-conductor.com is our website, and we are posting updates regularly about new screenings. We had a screening in the area in Washington recently, but we're having actually a big screening here with Orchids on December 17th at the Parkway. And we we did sell the film, and it will be distributed and be seen very broadly as of next March. And I can't say where yet, but it'll be, widely distributed in March. And I've completely forgot, since I just found this out yesterday, we will have a theatrical release in New York and LA between January and March as well.
That's fantastic. Bernadette, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.